Welcome back, everyone, to our read-through of The Gay Science. We're going to launch straight into Book 2 and pick up right where we left off last time. If you're just now joining us, we already have 5 episodes on Book 1 of The Gay Science, which are uploaded. So if you'd like to, I'd recommend going back and listening to all of those if you want to familiarize yourself with my analysis on Book 1. So we'll jump right into it with section number 57, entitled To the Realists. Quote, "You sober people who feel well armed against passion and fantasies and would like to turn your emptiness into a matter of pride and an ornament, you call yourselves realists and hint that the world really is the way it appears to you, as if reality stood unveiled before you only, and you yourselves were perhaps the best part of it, O you beloved images of Sais. But in your unveiled state, are not even you still very passionate and dark creatures compared to fish, and still far too similar to an artist in love? And what is reality for an artist in love? You are still burdened with those estimates of things that have their origin in the passions and loves of former centuries. Your sobriety still contains a secret and inextinguishable drunkenness. Your love of reality, for example, oh, that is a primeval love. Every feeling and sensation contains a piece of this old love, and some fantasy, some prejudice, some unreason, some ignorance, some fear, and ever so much else has contributed to it and worked on it. That mountain there, that cloud there, what is real in that? Subtract the phantasm and every human contribution from it, my sober friends, if you can. If you can forget your descent, your past, your training, all of your humanity and animality. There is no reality for us, not for you either, my sober friends. We are not nearly as different as you think, and perhaps our goodwill to transcend intoxication is as respectable as your faith that you are altogether incapable of intoxication." End quote. A perfect beginning, really, for Book 2, because we begin by reasserting Nietzsche's great metaphysical turn, which would give its due to both idealism and to materialism, while ultimately transcending both. And in that respect, Nietzsche's move here is arguably somewhat Hegelian, in that he invokes the arguments of someone like, say, Bishop Berkeley, when Nietzsche writes, quote, "That cloud there, what is real in that? Subtract the phantasm and every human contribution from it, my sober friends, if you can." End quote. So the cloud has a visual image, which we might say is created by light particles, but really it's created by light particles hitting the eye. So subtract the eye, what remains over? The image? Well, no. The image itself doesn't remain over, only the light particles, but we only see the light particles by means of creating an image of it, creating a representation, as Schopenhauer would have said. And we can do that with every sensory contribution that we make to the world, the way Nietzsche uses the term every human contribution, in the way in which the sensation is inconceivable without the human sense organ to receive it or to represent it. It's a signal without an antenna. And so every aspect of a given object's appearance contains something human. What would it quote-unquote look like for light particles to exist in absentia of an eye to behold them? What would a sound wave be when there's no auditory organ to experience hearing? It sounds rather Zen in a way, but it would be the sound that is unheard. So what remains? The wave? But the wave doesn't actually appear to us, so how are we to conceive of the wave? I mean, we can render it as a mathematical abstraction, give it a visual form, but the visual form isn't the actual wave, that's just another representation. So conceptualization of the world necessarily involves appearance, and every appearance is the contribution of some human sense organ. Remove all the human sense organs, and what of the phenomena remains? What of the world remains? Now, so that's the capitulation to idealism. But Nietzsche isn't saying it's nothing, because that claim would be to speculate on something that we can't speculate on. That would be a claim about mind-independent reality. It's truly as simple a claim as saying that we only know the appearance. We only know the world conditioned by the sense organs. And so it's not an attack on the veracity of the senses. It's saying that the question itself of what lies behind the senses is from the very start an attempt to cognize the noumenal. And that attempt always fails, in spite of the fact that we might try to give it a name, right? Because what are we saying that remains? Just by giving the noumenon a name, like substance or material. That's like when we name, the unexplained phenomenon that the majority of the movement in the universe can't be accounted for by the gravity of the observable matter that we see. Well, then there must be some unobservable matter, which we call dark matter. I would hope we would all see that the name dark matter is not an explanation of anything. It's the equivalent of an X in an equation. It's a placeholder for something that remains beyond our power to observe, but we haven't conceptualized it. Just by virtue of giving it a name, we haven't explained anything. And so that is what all of our claims about being are. All of our claims about reality with a capital R, insofar as reality is distinguished from the appearances. We don't have to actually do that, by the way. I mean, ultimately, Nietzsche's move in Twilight of Idols is to say, let's not distinguish reality from the appearance. Let's not make that distinction in the first place. But there's this pride in the realist's perspective, which we might say is the opposite of sort of the Berkeleyan, or even to some extent the Schopenhauerian, the Kantian critique of the senses. The realist is the person who holds to the view that the senses are real and that they do correspond to some sort of being. This is, the pride that Nietzsche talks about. It comes from his sobriety, his clear-headedness, and seeing the world the way it really is. That's the source of that pride. And Nietzsche is both undermining that view logically, that the conclusion that our appearance is real in some objective and mind-independent sense is just as much of an unjustified leap as the conclusion that, say, reality is nothing at all like it appears. Neither is founded on solid ground. They're both flights of fancy. Maybe we would even make that leap ourselves. Maybe it's best to think that the world of appearance is as it appears. That might be the most useful perspective to take for the purposes of scientific inquiry. Somebody on Patreon put that argument to me recently. But if we follow that logic through, then it's not a so-called sober, clear-headed position. It's a stance that we're taking for its utility, for its usefulness. This way of conceiving the world is the best thing for the sciences. And Nietzsche compares this metaphysical position to the state of mind of the artist in love, so the complete opposite of a detached scientific mind, at least in connotation. The metaphysical realist is drunk with a love for that feeling he gets when he feels as though he knows the real reality. And there's a reference to Schiller's poem, The Veiled Image at Sais. You beloved images of Sais is what Nietzsche says here. The poem is about a young seeker of knowledge who comes to Egypt, to the city of Sais, which was said to have a veiled statue of Isis. This is an excerpt from the first stanza, quote, "A youth, a thirst for knowledge, hot desire, to Sais came, intent to explore the dark and hoarded wisdom of Egyptian priests. Through many a grade of mystery hurrying on, far and more far, still pressed the inquiring soul, and scarce the Hierophant could cool or calm the studious fever of impatient toil." End quote. And so you might assume from this that Nietzsche is connecting the truth-seeking realist that he describes in 57, because the truth-seeker has a hot desire, a hungering to understand the metaphysical mysteries. But he calls the realists, Nietzsche calls the realists, images of Sais. Notice the sentence preceding this, quote, "as if reality stood unveiled to you only, and you yourselves were perhaps the best part of it," end quote. Now, in Schiller's poem, the young man wants to see the statue unveiled. And even though the priests say they could remove the veil, they don't remove it, ever. They say that the goddess has proclaimed that only she should be able to lift the veil of her image, and that any man who does so before this time will see the truth, which they seem to treat as an obvious warning. And the protagonist of the poem goes and removes the veil anyway, and no one knows what he saw, but he dies, with the warning that this will be the fate of he who impiously tries to, tear away the veils of truth. They'll see the truth but be destroyed by it. And notably, the priests say they have no desire even to see what's beneath the veil. And the young initiate can't understand this until the very end of the poem with his dying words. But Nietzsche calls the realists you images of Sais. So not the youth, not the priests, but the statue. And so the metaphor is, you think of your own perception of reality as though it were like the perception of the God who is behind the veil, as if you were seeing an unvarnished reality. But if we think about it, from the point of view of the statue, all of external reality is now veiled over, if we were thinking about seeing the world through the image's perspective. So if you think you are the truth, as if you are the image of Sais, your perception is the truth of the world, well, there's still a veil between you and the external world. Now, once again, I want to emphasize something, because people really, I've found, have a hard time not thinking in a binary here. Nietzsche's dialectic here is not aimed at saying that there is something behind the veil, so to speak, the real reality beyond the senses, or that there is nothing, or that what is behind the veil is the same as appearance, or that it's different from appearance. All of these are unjustified conclusions. His insight is simply that what you see is veil. So to the extent that we're talking about reality, we're talking about the veil. There, quote, there is no reality for us, end quote. And so implicitly at the end, the difference between the free spirit and the so-called realist, quote, perhaps our goodwill to transcend intoxication is as respectable as your faith that you are altogether incapable of intoxication, end quote. So those of us who have this awareness of the intoxication that comes with that pride in the senses, that pride that posits the sense organs as portals into the nature of the real, the noumenal. With that awareness comes our continuous goodwill not to be ensnared by this intoxication. But Nietzsche's not trying to alienate the realists. He says, you're not so different from us. He's trying to win them over to understanding that, in a way, the realist position, while it always sets itself up as being more hard-nosed and cynical, and many of these people who have that faith in the senses as the empirical reality is real, full stop, that whole position, their, what would we say? Their whole position presents itself as if it's on guard against pseudoscience and woo-woo, or whatever terms that, the new atheist types would like to use. And Nietzsche is simply saying that, hold on, saying that you're immune, your perception of reality through your senses somehow makes you immune to becoming intoxicated, going astray with your beliefs about reality. Believing things out of passion or out of prejudice or out of bias or so on and so forth. Thinking that you're immune to that does not actually help you guard against it better. The people, we'll use an analogy, like the people who are most susceptible to propaganda are the ones who think that they're immune to propaganda. So, in a way, Nietzsche's saying, be on guard against these conceptions of reality that happen to play to our own pride, to our own certainty in ourselves and what we already believe. Be on guard against pleasing and self-aggrandizing beliefs, because that is where we're likely to become intoxicated and thus deceived. So with that, we will move on to section 58. Quote, only as creators. This has given me the greatest trouble and still does. To realize that what things are called is incomparably more important than what they are. The reputation, name, and appearance, the usual measure and weight of a thing, what it counts for, originally almost always wrong and arbitrary, thrown over things like a dress, and altogether foreign to their nature and even to their skin. All this grows from generation onto generation merely because people believe in it, until it gradually grows to be part of the thing and turns into its very body. What at first was appearance becomes in the end almost invariably the essence and is effective as such. How foolish it would be to suppose that one only needs to point out this origin and this misty shroud of delusion in order to destroy the world that counts for real, so-called reality. We can destroy only as creators, but let us not forget this either. It is enough to create new names and estimations and probabilities in order to create, in the long run, new things. End quote. So, understanding Nietzsche's project, his anti-metaphysical project, the about-face he performs in metaphysics, this passage is very helpful for that, and it clearly flows directly from the previous section in 57. He describes how the names of phenomena are more important than the individual distinct sense impressions from particular events and things. The way that we classify and categorize and name things creates an entire linguistic world, an intelligible world on top of the phenomenal world, which in principle, the phenomenal world is only sensation and representation, right? It's not permitted to make a further claim beyond that. The sense impressions and the mental representing of that impression into an object or event, that is what we have. And presumably every sensing being, every animal does this, but only a rare few, like us, have language, and therefore name these phenomena, and therefore confound or associate phenomena together with a class of phenomena. A whole slew of traits or attributes or representations, however we want to put it, which, as Nietzsche says, might have nothing to do with the reality. And I'll give you an example. Let's take Pluto, the debate about whether Pluto is a planet, which it's not really a debate. Most scientists will say Pluto is not a planet. But is planet an objective category that exists in nature? Well, no categories exist in nature. Well, what is it? Is planet a Platonic form? It's not even really a qualitative distinction so much as a quantitative one. The difference being, what we're actually arguing over is whether it's a planet or a planetoid, which is just a matter of scale. So we have this whole world of names and categories for astronomical phenomena, which those are not from nature, and they're not for nature. These names are from us and they're for us. It's created within our linguistic world for the sake of our understanding and communicating about the world. So planet is a category which is imposed, and the debate about Pluto's classification has nothing to do with our sense impressions of Pluto, or with the actual reality of Pluto as it appears. Most lay people who would weigh in on this question have never even seen Pluto, even through a telescope, because, we haven't even been aware of Pluto's existence for all that long compared to some of the other planets, and it's not easy to see. So, that's what the real argument is over. It's not an argument over the objective facts. Like, people aren't confused over the actual size of Pluto. They're confused over, or they disagree what the threshold should be for calling something a planet, for naming it, right? And this debate is far more important to people than it should be. But why would that be? And, beyond this, Nietzsche's making a point that Jung would later make about the statistical ideal, as Jung would have called it. As Nietzsche says, the weight and measure and dimensions of a given named phenomenon that come to be associated with that phenomenon often have nothing to do with its individual instantiations. In the same way as Jung says, if you determine the average weight of the pebbles in a given riverbed to weigh 5 grams, that doesn't mean you should expect to pick up one of the pebbles at random and find one that is exactly 5 grams. And he says, in fact, it's possible that no pebble in the entire riverbed is the exact weight of the average. And so this is a fairly straightforward point, I think, but the simple truth is that in any category, whether that's your mental image of like a given, like a tree, or your mental image of a philosopher, your mental image of a car crash or of a snowflake, whatever it might be, any named thing, you're imagining an ideal average, the standard image that best fits the name. But I used the last example, snowflake, for a reason, because no two of them are alike, right? And to the extent that we reason from the ideal image of the phenomenon, reason from the ideal image in order to draw conclusions about specific instances and events, we're always liable to falsify the actual situation, which is almost always going to be irregular in some way. That the regular character of reality is its irregularity. That's what we find with regularity. And this is all Jung's language here from The Undiscovered Self. And so Nietzsche says, we throw all of these connotations, all of this baggage, this linguistic framework over everything like a dress. And, Nietzsche often discusses the skin or the surface of a given phenomenon versus the inner workings. But here, the dress, the linguistic veil, we might call it, it even hides the skin, he says. It's unrelated, it's a foreign substance even to the skin of the phenomenon. So this intelligible world, the linguistic world, that's where our metaphysics exists. That's where our moral ideas exist. And Nietzsche suggests here, we should not be worried that his insights will destroy that world. As if by exposing this misty shroud of delusion for what it is, that we'll stop being linguistic creatures. We'll stop being moral or metaphysical creatures. He does say that by creating new names and estimations and probabilities, we create new things, which is in quotes in the passage. So not things in the sense of we create new physical objects, because, well, if you want to get right down to it, there's no such thing as a physical object, because an object, the very notion of an object, that's one of those imposed categories. And what is the conceptualization of the ideal average of just an object in general? Not any kind of object, just an object, right? Very hard to say what we're actually talking about. But because it's very difficult to say where, to clearly delineate where the object ends and the rest of external reality begins, in a way you could say we create objects through the act of naming them, in that if everything is sort of conceived of as this indeterminate flux before we impose that linguistic order upon it, it's just sort of a difference in the way that we carve up or divide the world. Really, that's what the dispute would be over in naming. So in full awareness that this naming function creates quote-unquote things, or that it invents or reifies objects, makes them real within our mind, Nietzsche seems to be saying we should proceed with that understanding if we want to, for example, self-legislate new values. Peter Sloterdijk's work is interesting to think about in light of all this. By changing the language game, you change or you alter the veil that you're throwing over reality. And that's a veil we can't live without, right? We can't live in absentia of that. And so thereby you change the whole experience of reality by changing the way the naming conventions are set, the way the language game is played. But this is the turn. So metaphysics presents itself as if it is showing us something behind the world, behind the veil, again, to use that metaphor. As if, a metaphysical claim, a claim of being, is a claim about that which both transcends and stands behind the external world as we experience it, as it appears. It is past, beyond the fallibility of the senses. Nietzsche's reversal is to say that metaphysics is not behind the world, it's layered on top of the world. So we might say that the phenomena is the skin, and we're putting a dress, we're putting a veil on top of it. The veil isn't the senses, the veil is the language, the linguistic categories we've created and then placed on top of the world. So metaphysics, morality, really all of religion and philosophy, every linguistic phenomenon is not beneath the world, it's on top of it. And I know that explanation is inherently metaphorical, but that's sort of a necessary evil. I think you get the meaning. Metaphysics is not fundamental to the senses, something prior to it, the cause of it. Metaphysics is created by beings, us, for whom reality is fundamentally sensation. And then metaphysics is added on top of it. That is Nietzsche's great metaphysical turn that I think comes through in this passage. So let's move on to 59. Quote, "We artists, when we love a woman, we easily conceive a hatred for nature on account of all the repulsive natural functions to which every woman is subject. We prefer not to think of all this, but when our soul touches on these matters for once, it shrugs, as it were, and looks contemptuously at nature. We feel insulted. Nature seems to encroach on our possessions, and with the profanest hands at that. Then we refuse to pay any heed to physiology and decree secretly, I want to hear nothing about the fact that a human being is something more than soul and form. The human being under the skin is for all lovers a horror and unthinkable, a blasphemy against God and love. Well, as lovers still feel about nature and natural functions, every worshipper of God and his holy omnipotence formerly felt. Everything said about nature by astronomers, geologists, physiologists, or physicians struck him as an encroachment into his precious possessions and hence as an attack, and a shameless one at that. Even natural law sounded to him like a slander against God. Really, he would have much preferred to see all of mechanics derived from acts of a moral will or an arbitrary will. But since nobody was able to render him this service, he ignored nature and mechanics as best he could and lived in a dream. Oh, these men of former times knew how to dream and did not find it necessary to go to sleep first. And we men of today still master this art all too well, despite all of our goodwill toward the day and staying awake. It is quite enough to love, to hate, to desire, simply to feel, and right away the spirit and power of the dream overcome us, and with our eyes open, coldly contemptuous of all danger, we climb up on the most hazardous paths to scale the roofs and spires of fantasy, without any sense of dizziness, as if we had been born to climb, we somnambulists of the day. We artists, we ignore what is natural. We are moonstruck and God-struck. We wander still as death, unwearied, on heights we do not see as heights, but as plains, as our safety. End quote. Now, just a brief note. This is the beginning of a section of several aphorisms about women. And I'm sure many of you know Nietzsche's reputation for when he talks about women, so brace yourself for that if that's something that you're not into. We're going to get through all of these aphorisms on women in this episode. But it should be noted, this first aphorism is ostensibly about women, but it's not really about women at all. It's actually, if you pay attention, it's an observation about how men feel about women. So it's a statement about men. It's a statement about the male gaze, if you like. But to speak seriously, it's not a comment about women so much as men's thinking while in love with women, which is, again, it's really a statement about men, which Nietzsche then is not using to make a claim about women. He's using it to make a comparative claim to the man of faith and his relationship to God. So he compares the way a lover thinks about his love and the way the theologian thought about God, or the sincere believer. In both cases, the uncomfortable and undignified realities of the natural world, this introduces a discomfort into the way we think about the object of our love. We refuse to believe it because of how it makes us feel. But it's a subversive comparison from the start. The theologian is compared with someone in a romance, which makes the love of God sort of equated with physical desires that the theologian would say has nothing to do with their love of God. But in doing this, Nietzsche is making a similar comparison to when he invokes the intoxication of the lover, or the artist and his passion for his work, in relation to the metaphysical seeker after truth, or the proud scientific realist. Nietzsche is always reminding us that philosophy is an impassioned activity, that science is an impassioned activity. Religion is also an impassioned activity. And these all can blind us and confound our ability to think with sobriety. And so Nietzsche ridicules the so-called sobriety of the realist, but his call in this chapter is to stay awake. He praises how easy it was for dreamers of past ages. For example, the men of the Middle Ages. They were extraordinary in that way, their ability to interpret everything in nature as the moral will of God, without, much sort of intellectual trouble or cognitive dissonance. They didn't think mechanistically at all. Whereas today, as we uncover all these truths about nature, about the reality of human biology and the reality of evolution and mundane causes of natural phenomena, cycles and patterns of nature, bringing us further and further into mechanism and away from this world that the dreamers of past ages were in love with, which was fundamentally a moral world. This is as much of a turnoff to them as, thinking about the digestive functions and the intestinal tract of the girl you're in love with. So, to put it in very vulgar language, Nietzsche is saying that the same reason why people say girls don't poop is the reason why the theist is opposed to mechanistic explanations of the world, or the biological origin of human beings. It's embarrassing, right? It's a turnoff. The theologian would prefer everything to be covered over or veiled by the Christian view of the world. And maybe this is a bit of an aside or a digression, but it is interesting. Within another religion, Buddhism, just as an interesting bit of trivia, they actually advise you to, I think this is specifically a sutra that's targeted at young men who have abandoned home, as they say, and taken up the role of a monk in a monastery. But they're still young men, so they still have the urges of a young man. And the sutra, the Buddhists have all sorts of different ways of trying to deal with or manage these like lustful, avaricious desires. But one of them would be to actually imagine exactly what we just described. Like, remember, the human body is just a bag of blood, and it's just a bunch of organs and digestive tracts in there. And the skin hides, conceals this really ugly biological reality that's not attractive or seductive at all if you get into the guts of another human being. And so it is interesting that the very thing that Nietzsche's pointing out, that the lover does not want to think about, and comparing that to the way the Christian thinks about the world as run by a god, the Buddhists actually say to think about that, to prevent yourself from falling into romantic love. And that's one of their ways of getting closer to their spirituality. So I don't know. It's kind of just a funny little irony there. But the last lines in this section, they involve Nietzsche's aesthetic project in philosophy, the approach of the musical Socrates, or we might say the person who's moved beyond thou shalts into the territory of saying I will. There is an irrational and arbitrary nature to our metaphysical suppositions, to our religious dogmas, to our explanations of reality. There's something in them that's not reasoned out, but simply demanded. That's the meaning of Nietzsche's lines at the end, which do not exclude us, the free spirits, presumably. Quote, we artists, we ignore what is natural. We are moonstruck and godstruck, end quote. So whatever worldview, whatever Weltanschauung that we come to, that is an artistic creation. It will always have an element of the artistic. And in that way, it's an ignoring of the natural. It's a leap beyond what a accounting of the hard facts tells us into an unjustified claim that is nevertheless demanded because without it we find we could not live. That's the nature of philosophy, for better or for worse. So now we come to the sections on women, or we're getting into these in earnest, and these are not as caustic as the sections in Beyond Good and Evil. And just as in the previous section, I would say this next one, 60, actually isn't about women. It's another passage about men and how they perceive women. So this is 60, quote, women and their action at a distance. Do I still have ears? Am I all ears and nothing else? Here I stand in the flaming surf whose white tongues are licking at my feet. From all sides I hear howling, threats, screaming, roaring coming at me, while the old earthshaker sings his aria in the lowest depths, deep as a bellowing bull, while pounding such an earth-shaking beat that the hearts of even these weather-beaten rocky monsters are trembling in their bodies. Then suddenly, as if born out of nothing, there appears before the gate of this hellish labyrinth, only a few fathoms away, a large sailboat, gliding along as silently as a ghost. Oh, what ghostly beauty! How magically it touches me! Has all the calm and taciturnity of the world embarked on it? Does my happiness itself sit in this quiet place, my happier ego, my second departed self, not to be dead and yet no longer alive, a spirit-like intermediate being, quietly observing, gliding, floating, as the boat that with its white sails moves like an immense butterfly over the dark sea? Yes, to move over existence. That's it. That would be something. It seems as if the noise here had led me into fantasies. All great noise leads us to move happiness into some quiet distance. When a man stands in the midst of his own noise, in the midst of his own surf of plans and projects, then he is apt also to see quiet magical beings gliding past him and to long for their happiness and seclusion. Women. He almost thinks that his better self dwells there among the women, and that in these quiet regions even the loudest surf turns into deathly quiet, and life itself into a dream about life. Yet, noble enthusiast, even on the most beautiful sailboat there is still a lot of noise, and unfortunately much small and petty noise. The magic and the most powerful effect of women is, in philosophical language, action at a distance, actio in distans. But this requires first of all, and above all, distance, end quote. So this aphorism is a bit like a prose poem, and Nietzsche is sort of describing this cacophonous scene at the beginning, which he later makes clear is sort of like the inner turmoil within, specifically we would think a thinker, right? But really any man, I guess he's saying. But I would take it as the experience that Nietzsche probably has himself. A man stands in the midst of his own noise, in the midst of his own surf of plans and projects, right? And then he sees at a distance, it's like the woman is compared to a sailboat gliding over existence, seemingly untouched by this chaotic roil within him, and then in this sort of prose poem externalized to all around him. And so the term action at a distance, this is a concept in physics that an object's motion can be affected by another object without being in physical contact with it. Nietzsche is just using this as a metaphor here, so we won't go too deeply into this, but this was central to Boscovich's theory of force point particles. That's a very influential scientific approach on the thinking of Nietzsche. And so action at a distance is just a metaphor in this passage, but it's worth noting, Nietzsche really does believe in action at a distance as a principle of physics. And it's a large part of how he thinks about will to power as a physical explanation of the world. And so the metaphor is simply that women perform a kind of action at a distance in the way they attract men. The woman's like an island of serenity and grace, gliding effortlessly against a background cacophony of noise and disruption. That is what she appears to be at a distance. That is the kind of attraction that occurs at a distance. Another reference I think of is like the Garden of Armida, the example from Torquato Tasso that Nietzsche cited before in Human All Too Human, an enchanted, almost illusory resting place that distracts the hero and causes him to fall into placidity in action and passivity. This is the allure of the opposite sex for a man whose mind is just running constantly. But of course, action at a distance only works at a distance. As soon as we get into a actual relationship with another human being, we usually find it's never that island of placidity for very long, is it? That romantic love creates its own forms of chaos and tension. And so you can read some misogyny into this passage if you really want to, but to me, that doesn't really actually even come through here. I think there's actually a great deal in it that doesn't even really depend on which sex that we're talking about in order for the passage to be insightful. In some ways, you could take this, you could decontextualize this passage and just take this as the allure of a pleasant, simple, loving relationship, especially to the kind of person who is always in their own head and anxious and nervous and perhaps always doubting themselves, or perhaps always, somewhere else, not in the present moment. And wow, here's somebody else who could really anchor me in the present, right? In some ways, Nietzsche is reminding us of the same wisdom that Spock voices in a famous episode of Star Trek, that having is not so pleasant a thing as wanting. It is not logical, but it is often true. So from a distance, we imagine all sorts of things about someone that we find attractive. The reality of the long-term engagement with another human being, especially romantically, is that all of those illusions are necessarily destroyed because they're only possible to maintain at a distance. And, speaking as someone who's married, you see a human being that you're married to, you see them on their worst days, you see their ugliest side. And you get into small and petty fights and have small and petty tensions, and whatever a relationship is, it's not involvement with a magical, quiet being that glides past you. It has nothing to do with the illusion that you're attracted to, the ideal that you create in your head that you become attracted to. When we are attracted to someone, we turn life into a dream about life, as Nietzsche says. But what is it that causes us to eventually wake up from that dream? Closeness, familiarity. So I think that pretty much gets this passage across. So let's go to 61. Actually, we'll depart from the woman question again for this aphorism, even for a few aphorisms. 61, quote, "In honor of friendship, in antiquity the feeling of friendship was considered the highest feeling, even higher than the most celebrated pride of the self-sufficient sage, somehow as the sole and still more sacred sibling of this pride. This is expressed very well in the story of a Macedonian king who gave an Athenian philosopher who despised the world a talent as a present, and promptly got it back. "How is that?" asked the king. "Has he no friend?" He meant, "I honor the pride of this independent sage, but I should honor his humanity even more if the friend in him had triumphed over his pride. The philosopher has lowered himself before me by showing that he does not know one of the two highest feelings, and the higher one at that." End quote. So let's think about Nietzsche's three prototypes for the wholly original philosophical type that came out of ancient Greece: Socrates, Pythagoras, Heraclitus. Very different people, but do any of these three have a care for wealth or social status or anything like that? No. In effect, it's the mark of the philosopher that he sees himself as above the struggle for worldly wealth and attainment. It's beneath his pride to deign to accept a monetary gift from a king. Think of Diogenes of Sinope and Alexander, a Greek philosopher and a Macedonian king, albeit not from Athens. But in any case, there's the famous, probably apocryphal anecdote where Alexander asks Diogenes, what are you doing? He's picking through the trash heap. And what are you doing picking through the trash heap? And Diogenes says, "I was looking for the bones of your ancestors, but as it turns out, they're indistinguishable from those of a commoner." So the philosopher's higher wisdom allows him to see past the desire for fleeting, unimportant things, such as worldly wealth, that you don't get to take with you across the river of Lethe. But that's a reason for why the Greek philosopher is in some ways un-Greek. He's very Greek in terms of his pride. We discussed that in the last book of the Gay Science. He's very Greek in terms of his excess. The Hellenes do everything with a kind of excess. Even their philosophical types are excessive in their pursuit of the philosophical life. But the philosopher is un-Greek in that they do not sufficiently value what was universally valued in antiquity, especially among the Greeks: friendship. And there is the assertion in this passage that to accept a friend's gift is an act of self-lowering, for the sake of showing their love for their friend. To receive a gift, then, would be to take on a kind of shame in such cultures where one's nobility is shown by gift-giving. That's a social dynamic that a lot of people probably don't understand in modernity, because outside parts of Asia, most of us don't consider receiving a gift to be a great self-lowering. I mean, there are nuances and exceptions to this. I mean, even as recently as a couple decades ago, right, in America, it would have been uncommon, or it would not have been uncommon, to encounter people who would regard taking charity as a kind of, a shameful thing to do. But, usually if you have a very rich and powerful friend and you're a humble philosopher, a modern man wouldn't shy at taking, let's say, an endowment from such a person, right? So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that this is an ancient philosopher's type of pride, which is so far beyond our own pride, which is then put into competition with or tension with that ancient valuation of friendship, which is also so far beyond our own conception. And that, in fact, because friendship is so important, it even requires these cultures which were obsessed with pride to be willing to part with a share of their pride for the sake of friendship, such that failing to do so is even a little shameful. Failing to lower yourself before me by not knowing that friendship is supposed to overwhelm your pride is in a way a shameful thing. It is a way that you've lowered yourself in an even worse way. Our culture is nowadays it's not pride-based, but I would argue guilt-based. So we could imagine an analogous situation maybe in which, there could be a competition or tension between guilt and friendship. So perhaps a friend asks you to ignore feelings of guilt over something so you could come to their aid. I mean, this is the kind of late night question you drunkenly ask your buddies, like, "Hey, if I killed somebody, would you help me bury the body?" Would you take on a moral guilt or a legal guilt for the sake of your friend? That would really be the closest thing we could probably get to this kind of tension. Would you wound your own pride for the sake of your friends? And there are many cultures to this day outside of the West where loyalty to one's friends is assumed over and above any legal or moral obligations. Or even especially in the case of loyalty to one's family, that's even more common. So, there are some ways we could come close to understanding this kind of conflicted feeling that we could imagine such a philosopher might have had. But that shows us even more clearly just how the ancient world had a different valuation of things than we do, in that we moderns don't tend to value our pride quite so highly. At the very least, even though plenty of people are proud, that's regarded as bad, right? That's self-absorbed, it's vain. That's not usually celebrated or emulated in our popular myths. But why should that be the case? I mean, is pride inherently bad? It seems to be a normal human emotion, but to Christians, it's one of the worst sins. And that brings us back to the insight that Nietzsche brought up earlier. The way we name and categorize aspects of the human experience changes what we associate with those experiences, how we understand those experiences. Pride being classed as a deadly sin for 2,000 years, naming pride as a cardinal sin, that has had an effect of making us averse to pride, quite frankly, to the point where most of us would say that pride is a negative quality, in spite of the fact that it's quite natural to feel pridefully about yourself, at least at some points in your life. And, we would probably have to admit that a certain degree of pride is helpful or useful. So even though we've kind of gone beyond the content of the passage at this point with this line of inquiry, I think that's what Nietzsche's work is meant to do. You're meant to continue this line of questioning he raises for yourself. Pride and friendship were these powerful values in the ancient world to a degree that we don't really experience today. Why would that be? Why would that change? And if it has changed, for one, that raises the question, could our current moral valuations change today? Could those change, especially given another 2,000 years? And then furthermore, just to put the question to ourselves, what kind of tensions of those cardinal values exist within our lives today that might be comparable to what that Greek philosopher receiving the gift from the Macedonian king would experience? All right, let's go to 62, a section that is one sentence long. Quote, "Love. Love forgives the lover even his lust." End quote. Again, the state of mind of the romantic lover is so useful for Nietzsche because it's a universal experience, the state of mind, and it points to the reality warping nature of our feelings and desires. Not just how we feel about the world, but quite literally how we experience it and perceive it. And there's a way, when you're in love, you can rationalize almost any course of action to yourself, so long as it leads you to that goal, right? And so in the same way, when we're in love, not with a person, but with a worldview, or with a moral idea, or with just any interpretation of the facts at hand that makes us happy, or gives us contented or pleasing feelings, we'll rationalize anything, employ any kind of motivated reasoning to hold on to those feelings. Lust is not so much denigrated these days the way it was in Christendom. But even we moderns, right, in certain contexts, we certainly treat lust as a dangerous and potentially, we'll say like a vicious state of mind. Go read the comments section on any Reddit thread about cheating or adultery and see how many comments there are, made in approval of adultery and how many are expressing even like violent fantasies about killing adulterers and stuff like that. I mean, there's far more comments in the latter category. People have a visceral, almost hysterical reaction to infidelity, even in a society where we've long since acknowledged that human beings are animals with natural sexual urges. We still expect those that have made a monogamous commitment. We expect that they be required to subdue those natural urges for the sake of keeping an oath, essentially, right? And people who are polyamorous or whatever is popular these days, almost to a person, if you ask them, they'll still say, well, all parties involved have to be informed and consenting. So we still have a sexual morality. We still have the concept that lust cannot necessarily be acted on in all cases. And however far we seem to have moved beyond that in terms of social views, I mean, again, just look at how people think about cheaters. And typically it's a visceral hatred that you'll get anytime you look to public opinion, which doesn't make sense if you think about humans, like if you actually think from the stance of like moral relativism, or if you're thinking about humans and human sexuality like it's just an animal urge. So clearly human beings don't, we have not actually moved beyond that. But I guess what I'm getting at here, somebody who's infatuated with somebody else can rationalize even that. They can say to themselves, well, maybe acting on the feeling is wrong, but how can the feeling itself be wrong, right? Maybe the feeling's just natural, or God made me feel this way, or love is never wrong, even if the social circumstances aren't permitting, whatever the rationalization might be. The fact remains, this is motivated reasoning. And in actual fact, society designates all sorts of feelings as dangerous and forbidden, and less desirable than others, certainly when it comes to acting on them, but even the feeling itself. And how we think about our inner states, it's shaped by the social mores and those obligations that society establishes to hold to those oaths and agreements that we've decided are necessary to the social fabric. But even somebody who has been raised within civilization, whose ancestors have been raised in civilization, we might say a human being who has, so to speak, been civilized for hundreds of thousands of years, even he, if he's in love, he will forgive himself even of his lust. And I hope I've demonstrated that lust is still, we might say, we might have to put an asterisk by it in modern times, right? Because we don't treat adultery as a crime, and we don't treat premarital sex as if it's, the worst thing ever anymore. But there are ways in which lust is circumscribed. And all of those will even be violated by this incredibly strong feeling. And it won't just be the person saying, I know this is morally wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. That feeling, that instinct will be so powerful as to actually warp their perception of reality such that it's not even in line with what the collective thinks anymore. So anyway, let's move on. The following aphorisms are a series of shorter ones, mostly like a short paragraph, and they mostly return to the questions about women, or the meditations on women, we might say. They're mostly straightforward, but I just want to draw out a couple of short observations about each of them. The plan is to cover the next handful in a kind of rapid-fire mode, because I think the gender politics thing is probably not going to be terribly interesting to the audience, and it's not terribly interesting to myself. But I want to kind of look at where Nietzsche's comments on women actually contain some interesting philosophical notion or reference behind them, or even just parallel or perpendicular to them even. So let's go to 63. Quote, "Woman in music. Why is it that warm, rainy winds inspire a musical mood and the inventive pleasure of melodies? Are they not the same winds that fill the churches and arouse thoughts of love in women?" End quote. My only comment here is, I think Nietzsche is invoking the idea of correspondence thinking, we might call it. It's a very common way of thinking in China. It's part of the yin-yang philosophy. I've talked about this a lot before, but you see a correspondence between a thing. So fire is red and fire is hot, therefore red equals hot. So we still include this today. We don't think of it like it's literally magic, but we, in the way that perhaps people in past ages did, but we'll still use red as like a symbol for hot, right? If you have an electrical stove, a lot of the time to show you that the surface is still hot even after you've turned it off, it'll have like a red light or something like that, right? But in past ages, Ernst Cassirer talks about this, like in a shamanic tradition. Let's say that you're doing a ritual to try and cause the gods to make it rain. You might like pour water on the ground, because those droplets of water are in some sense the same thing as the rain, and in replicating the way that the rain falls from the heavens to earth on a small scale, perhaps you can make it recur on a large scale, something of that nature. This kind of thinking is also found in the West, in Western alchemy, to some extent in Western medicine and the Galenic tradition. So the idea that warm, rainy winds might stir the emotions, that is not such a crazy idea from that, or that might stir certain emotions, right? That's not such a crazy idea from this angle of correspondence thinking. And then conversely, dry and cool wind might steady the emotions, right? So why would Nietzsche bring this up? Well, I mean, I think he actually believes in this to some extent. And I don't think he would have taken it to the kinds of extremes of a medieval alchemist. But we have to remember the focus on environment and the influence of one's environment on their thought, on their temperament, what kind of character they are, what they value. This is something that Nietzsche experiences when he's trying to moderate the symptoms of his condition by traveling to places with different climates and different altitude and air pressure and humidity and so on and so forth, to see what kind of external factors will make life most tolerable. And speaking as an artist myself, I mean, yeah, a certain kind of weather clearly inspires different moods. Even if it doesn't necessarily cause you to have a pronounced emotional swing or something like that, it can definitely influence the kind of art you create, or it can influence you perhaps on a very subtle level. You just have a different energy if you're playing music on a dreary, rainy day or a sweltering hot day. And this is a real phenomenon that Nietzsche is describing. It doesn't really connect to a more profound point, though, in my opinion, except insofar as it is, I guess, somewhat profound just in and of itself to source our inner states to the effect of external forces. Because, I would say increasingly so, in the modern day, people will pay lip service to that idea. But I think most of us tend to operate as if we're totally autonomous and arbitrarily governing agents, practically speaking. So we'll move on to 64. Quote, "Skeptics. I am afraid that old women are more skeptical in their most secret heart of hearts than any man. They consider the superficiality of existence its essence, and all virtue and profundity is to them merely a veil over this truth, a very welcome veil over a pudendum, in other words, a matter of decency and shame, and no more than that." End quote. And the Latin term for pudendum simply means shame. So specifically speaking of older women, he says they're more skeptical than any man, which would seem to be a compliment coming from Nietzsche. I mean, sure, he says they're superficial, but remember the preface to this whole book. The Greeks were superficial out of profundity because they stopped at the surface. And that's actually what he says here about older women. When he elaborates on what he means by this, he basically extrapolates this into a kind of epistemological orientation to the world, which is a bit funny because that seems like a bit of a leap. But, on the one hand, I can see how people would say this passage is still insulting to women insofar as he's saying all that matters to them is decency and shame, as he puts it. And what are these but public-facing virtues? There's something you possess to the degree that it is believed by others about you. So, in effect, these are reactive virtues or values because one reacts to the perception of the crowd in accordance with them. So, given all of this, is this an insult or a compliment? And it's difficult to say. And I think, we should be let's be charitable to Nietzsche here. Let's take away any inferences we might want to make, or inferences we might wish to draw that would lead us to a prescriptive statement, which I think is fair considering how Nietzsche normally writes. Normally, he doesn't write with the aim of leading you to some normative position. Well, in that case, it's neither. He's simply saying the feminine is outwardly facing, concerned with external perception. Perhaps he zeroes in on older women because they're the most experienced in the social battlefield, the battle of external perception. And they're no longer really in the mating game, so their only capital in life at this point is dignity or shame. So they make the superficiality of existence into its essence. The surface is everything. Agree or disagree as we might with that assessment, we might take something useful from this aphorism, insofar as we might ask, is there a kind of person, regardless of the gender, who is so concerned with the superficial that they actually make the surface of existence into its essence? When Nietzsche was speaking about the Greeks doing this, I think Nietzsche would say the surface for them was the body. But in this passage, the surface is the public appearance, the public profile, we might say. Is there actually a similar profundity in seeing the public profile as all there is? Well, someone like Hans-Georg Müller might say that, in fact, yes, the public profile is one way of creating identity, and there is no essential or core identity behind that. You could maybe even intermingle your techniques for creating identity, right? You might have the public profile identity technology and use it in combination with earlier identity technologies, but ultimately the identity is something socially negotiated. It doesn't exist within you as a kind of sole possession or something like that. And if this were in fact the case, that the reality of the public profile is sort of supersedes anything like a authentic core to the self or something like this, then recognizing that fact of the fundamental reality of the superficial, that the fact that the way that people perceive you might actually be more important than the way you feel inside, just to put it in very vulgar, straightforward terms for the purposes of making a point, that would be a profound recognition, right? Especially in a world where there's a perpetual clinging to this essentialist view of the self as an ego or a soul. And so, again, there's a way in which, charitably, Nietzsche is sort of paying tribute to older women in this passage, that they see many things because of how skilled at the social battlefield that they are. And the superficial world, the world of the surface, has become so, their absorption in it is so complete that it has become the essence, which to Nietzsche is actually closer to the truth than any kind of essentialist thinking. So we'll move on to 65. Quote, "Devotion. There are noble women who are afflicted with a certain poverty of the spirit, and they know no better way to express their deepest devotion than to offer their virtue and shame. They own nothing higher. Often this present is accepted without establishing as profound an obligation as the donors had assumed. A very melancholy story." End quote. So this is kind of a difficult passage. I discussed this with a few friends, both of them previous guests on the podcast, actually. Because it's so vague, it's a bit hard to know what Nietzsche is saying here, but he's using a lot of the language, something I zeroed in on, the language of exchange and debt and repayment, and it's bringing that into the arena of romantic relationships. And the way he phrases it, some women are so spiritually poor that all they have is their virtue and their shame. And there could be a sexual undertone to this. The woman in Nietzsche's time was brought up to consider sexuality shameful. We still have that expression even in English, although it's probably rarely used these days. Cover your shame, right? Refer to covering your genitals or your naked body. That's actually quite literally where the word shame derives from. It's from a word, I believe, for the vulva. So etymologically, there's a connection there. The very melancholy story is that the woman's virtue and her shame, or it could be translated as her virtue and her modesty, is received without treating it as such a large gift as she thinks it is. And again, Nietzsche describes her as in a state of spiritual poverty. So we might imagine that to an impoverished person, speaking here not of romance, but of just a normal exchange of goods, right? Giving up something as a gift that is to the rest of us of little value, it might be a great gift for you if you're extremely poor because that's all you have. So if we're both stranded on a desert island and I give you my last cigarette, that's a huge gift. But if I bum you a cigarette at the country club, anyone who considered that a great gift and expected a great deal of gratitude for that gift would be considered probably pretty petty. And so if we apply that monetary dynamic of the person who has very little giving a gift that is a great expense to them to someone who doesn't recognize it, if we apply that to romantic relationships, what Nietzsche is drawing out here is that the woman in some sense stands to lose more. She has to give away more in devoting herself to a romantic partner because sexuality is supposed to be shameful for her, and so on and so forth. But notice again, by the very fact that Nietzsche says there are noble women who are afflicted with poverty of the spirit, that would imply there are noble women who are not afflicted by poverty of the spirit, who would be, so to speak, rich in spirit. And it's not clear what else they would have to offer in a relationship. Presumably it would be a gift of the spirit, right? So what? Intelligence, personality, emotional depth, the soul of a poet. What is it that a man should expect, right? And I might believe that Nietzsche himself would desire a partner with those traits, but I can't believe that he would think that people demand these traits in general, right? That you're spiritually poor unless you have a great personality, because let's be honest, almost nobody has a great personality. So this is ultimately a passage that can be taken many ways because Nietzsche is so vague. But at the very least, he's saying some women have nothing more to give than their modesty and their virtue. right? So that could be taken with the sexual undertone. It could just simply be, the normal things that are expected out of someone who becomes devoted to another human being, right? They think that this is a great gift because it's all they have. And the typical story, for whatever reason, is that men, in general, don't appreciate this gift. And it's a very sad story. So take from that what you will. Let's move on to 66. Quote, "The strength of the weak. All women are subtle in exaggerating their weaknesses. They are inventive when it comes to weaknesses in order to appear as utterly fragile ornaments who are hurt even by a speck of dust. Their existence is supposed to make men feel clumsy and guilty on that score. Thus they defend themselves against the strong and the, quote, law of the jungle," end quote. This is another one of those passages where I think it's helpful if we set aside women as the subject of the passage for at least a moment. You can still consider it from that angle, but let's consider this as a passage just about how the reactive works. It works by separating the active force from what it can do. So in concrete terms, Nietzsche is saying the strength of the weaker party in the politics between the two genders attains its end by making the stronger party, the masculine, guilty. Makes him look brutish and clumsy in comparison to the fragile and delicate women. That would also imply, you could take from this the inference that this is a mere act, that they're not so fragile as they might present themselves. Or you could take it that that's simply the incentive, is always to portray themselves as weak, regardless of whether they are or not. Now, personally, when it comes to the gender thing, I think the passage is full of overgeneralizations, but perhaps overgeneralizations that may have made more sense in Wilhelmine Germany, but I think we can move on. Let's go to 67. Quote, "Simulating oneself. Now she loves him and looks ahead with quiet confidence, like a cow. Alas, what bewitched him was precisely that she seemed utterly changeable and unfathomable. Of steady weather he found too much in himself. Wouldn't she do well to simulate her old character? To simulate a lack of love. Is this not the counsel of love? Vivat comedia." End quote. That last line means long live comedy. So this is, I only have a short remark here. This is the reverse of what Nietzsche said before in section 60 about women and their action at a distance. Before, she appeared as a lone sailing ship, an island of grace in a world of noisy distraction, and against the backdrop of one's internal upheavals. That's the power of women to attract men to them from a distance, because this is sort of like an illusion that disappears with closeness. And then later we realize that her soul only appeared to be placid. In fact, she's a source of chaos. In a thousand little ways, she introduces chaos or tension or upheaval into life in the way that every romantic relationship does. But in this passage, it's the reverse. Before, she appeared as like a source. She appeared changeable. Perhaps she was a source of chaos. And now she's something stable and boring. She's steadied herself. And Nietzsche says it might even advantage her. The comedic aspect is that it might advantage her to simulate her old self, which means simulating a lack of love. What does this mean? Well, back when she seemed changeable, maybe a bit more mercurial or flighty, not yet attached to her male suitor or lover, not yet committed to him, he felt as though her love was not a sure thing, because it wasn't. And that was more exciting. And he had to sort of win her over. Again, a lot of Nietzsche's reflecting a lot of the sort of social truths of Wilhelmine Germany. But, I think there is some truth to this. And so really the only thing to sort out here is Nietzsche being inconsistent? Yes. But it's also hard to make universal statements about relationships. And I almost would wonder if, both are true, right? Both things could be true, that you might get into a relationship seeking stability and actually find more chaos in a different way. You might get into a relationship seeking excitement and then find that it's actually a little bit boring. Now, and that might apply to different kind of people. There are different kinds of people at different times in their lives. Now, personally, I think you'd be crazy to listen to Nietzsche for relationship advice. But all the same, I think he is self-aware of this to some extent, as he tells us in Beyond Good and Evil, self-aware of his own limitations here. Because remember, when he prefaces the sections on women and relationships in Beyond Good and Evil, he says, these are only my truths. And that's really the only section where he takes the pains to say that, because you could extrapolate from Nietzsche's philosophy generally that you should always assume these are only my truths, right? So why does Nietzsche take the time to say that when he's making statements specifically about women? And I think it's easy to recognize the innate subjectivity that exists when one is commenting on relationships or on gender politics or whatever we want to call it. So that's at least one thing in Nietzsche's favor, is that he is aware that these statements are opinions. And I mean that in a Socratic sense, as in opinions as statements with a lesser degree of truth to them than a statement of fact. So let's go to 68 now. Quote, "Will and willingness. Someone took a youth to a sage and said, 'Look, he is being corrupted by women.' The sage shook his head and smiled. 'It is men,' said he, 'that corrupt women, and all the failings of women should be atoned by and improved in men. For it is man who creates for himself the image of woman, and woman forms herself according to this image.' 'You are too kind-hearted about women,' said one of those present. 'You do not know them.' The sage replied, 'Will is the manner of men, willingness that of women. That is the law of the sexes, truly a hard law for women. All of humanity is innocent of its existence, but women are doubly innocent. Who could have oil and kindness enough for them?' 'Damn oil, damn kindness,' someone else shouted out of the crowd. 'Women need to be educated better.' 'Men need to be educated better,' said the sage, and beckoned to the youth to follow him. The youth, however, did not follow him." End quote. So it's passages like this one that made me actually want to cover this section of this run of aphorisms here, because to be honest, I thought about skipping them altogether, not necessarily because of the sexism, but I just find a lot of it to be a bit of a slog, right? Nietzsche is not a relationship expert, and so his insights are extremely limited here. But 68 shows us how oftentimes Nietzsche's thought, forbidden though it may be to modern ears, is actually far more complex on these topics than he's often given credit for. It's not like when you read a passage like this one in 68, it's not a simple matter of like Nietzsche hated women or, whatever vulgarized version of Nietzsche's sexism is said to be. Yes, Nietzsche is sexist in that he believes there are certain determined features of the individual according to their biological sex. And he would even go so far as to say that a healthy society recognizes this and assigns different social status and different tasks and different kinds of prestige or different vices and virtues even based on your biological sex. But it's not as simple as saying women bad, because this passage would seem to say, well, it's men who make women that way. Men bad, right? Women don't corrupt men. What are you talking about? Who has all the political and social power here? Men corrupt women. Whatever they do to corrupt men after that is still indirectly the fault of men. Maybe this is a non sequitur, but I think Nietzsche's critique of gender politics here bears some resemblance to the way I've talked about critiques of Western civilization and defenders of Western civilization, in that the major critiques of the West come out of the West. Marxism, supposing it is a conspiracy to destroy the West, is nevertheless a Western product, which calls into question, like, is the West conspiring to destroy the West? Is the West such a great civilization in the first place? It seems to be the only one with these masochistic and self-doubting thoughts, right? It's one of the most masochistic great civilizations ever to exist. And meanwhile, the anti-Western Marxist ultimately has the Western Enlightenment to thank for his anti-Westernism, right? So how anti-Western is the Marxist? So here Nietzsche is saying, I guess by analogy, to make the analogy, whatever problem you have with women is the fault of men, being the stronger of the sexes from his point of view. If we didn't know better, if you were to read this passage out of context, aside from a few subtle details, you could easily mistake this as a prototypical analysis based on the notion of patriarchy. But the clue that something else is going on here, I think, is in the line that man creates himself in the image of women, and then that women form themselves according to that image. I think an astute reader will see that ultimately Nietzsche is saying the image that each respective gender forms of the other arises mutually, as the Chinese would say, because both have the image of the ideal of the other gender, which then influences the other gender. The image that each one forms of the ideal of what the other gender is supposed to be influences the ideal that the other gender is forming of the said. It's very difficult. The image that men form of women influences the image that women form of men. That's the way to say it. So I have no idea if this passage specifically in Nietzsche has ever been influential on other thinkers, but I think we can see the origin of some ideas in Jung here. The anima and the animus. We can even say that something of Freud and even something of Baudrillard might be prefigured in that idea alone of the ideal or the image, the representation that each one forms affecting the representation that the other forms. But there's also something else I want to draw attention to. So all of humanity is innocent of its existence. That's one of the things the sage says. And that's a point I've emphasized. I've put a great emphasis on that aspect of Nietzsche, the return to innocence. And in some sense, getting this insight of the fundamental innocence of ourselves, innocent as any other thing in nature, that's the key thing for Nietzsche. If you really grasp that core idea, you've grasped so many things in Nietzsche. And he says here women are doubly innocent. Why? Well, we could say that as a matter of historical and biological fact, it's the male half of the species that does the fighting, and therefore ventures out into the chaos between states, into the law of the jungle that is warfare, as Nietzsche calls it in a previous passage. And that wouldn't be true with every species. With, say, lions or hyenas, it's the females that do the hunting. But in the human species, men are to this day the ones drafted to go fight in wars. And so they're at least exposed to the state of nature, even if they're a part of civilization. And tying the state of nature to war is not a radical idea, by the way. The first usage of the concept in Hobbes actually appears that way. Hobbes calls it the state of war. And it's exposure to the state of war that reveals this cruel and samsaric nature of biological existence. And that is where humanity has typically begun to condemn life, right? And condemn the world and invent the concept of guilt. We localize it within that experience of nature, right? The law of the jungle experience of nature, which is by no means the only experience of nature, right? Civilization is also a part of nature, is sort of what I'm getting at here. It's something that grows within nature, just as a hive of bees, the bee civilization, we might call it, that's a part of nature too. Nobody would say bees aren't a part of nature. So the human state is also a part of nature. But typically those who condemn the natural brutality and animal impulses of mankind, they advocate instead for a kind of pacifistic or philanthropic existence. And what we have to notice about that is that those are the kind of values that can only grow, they can only exist really within the bounds of civilization, right? So the monastery, it's one of the most civilized places on earth, right? And so women, as the creatures of civilization, who under the conditions of order and flourishing, never have to experience the state of nature, right? If women are experiencing the law of the jungle, the state of nature, I mean, that's the fall of Rome. You have bigger problems in your society, right? So normally they don't. And that means that they're doubly innocent, right? Because even if all nature is innocent, it's the experience of the state of war, the law of the jungle, bella omnium contra omnes, that leads us to see the ugly side of nature, and that's where nature begins to be condemned. That's where man begins to say, find some sort of superordinate moral or metaphysical principle by which to judge existence. Women aren't even exposed to the impetus for that, is what Nietzsche is saying. So, once again, this passage points to some very interesting concepts in Nietzsche's philosophy, simply casually invokes them, really. And even though we can take or leave the gender politics of the 1800s, there's still something philosophically fecund in these sections. So these sections on women and romance, let's move on to 69. Quote, "Capacity for revenge. If someone cannot defend himself and therefore does not want to, we do not consider this a disgrace. But we have little respect for anyone who lacks both the capacity and the goodwill for revenge, regardless of whether it is a man or a woman. Would a woman be able to hold us, or as they say, enthrall us, if we did not consider it quite possible that under certain circumstances she could wield a dagger, any kind of dagger, against us, or against herself, which in certain cases would be a crueler revenge, Chinese revenge, end quote. So again, this is not really a section about women. He starts out by saying that the capacity for revenge is how we come to respect someone, whether they're a man or a woman. It's the second half of the passage where Nietzsche makes the suggestion we wouldn't find a woman as enthralling if she couldn't take revenge on us. But really, that second half in the passage, what is the work it's doing in this passage, in the structure of the argument? The work it's doing in the passage is to prove the first statement, that we respect the capacity of revenge. We disrespect the lacking of that capacity in all human beings, regardless of whether they're male or female. And I think we can imagine that most people reading that passage in the 19th century would have accepted that adage when it comes to men, right? But they would have doubted it when it comes to women, who in Wilhelmine Germany are supposed to be harmless and demure. Nietzsche saying, no, you actually want a partner that you feel has like the capacity to revenge herself against you. Which, what does that really mean? Nietzsche's saying you actually want a partner that has agency. That's the real meaning of agency, not some vague concept of feeling sovereign in your decisions or something. It's not unbounded, arbitrary, quote-unquote, free will, whatever that would mean. Agency means quite simply power. And so there is a hint of the will to power idea here, that what we really respect is power. That is what Nietzsche is indirectly sort of drawing on by invoking the ability to avenge oneself. I mean, think of the master and slave morality. The different valuations that sit at the base of them are based on what? Whether one is able to avenge himself or not. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean revenge is good, right? In the final analysis, Nietzsche would seem to say revenge is something that we should hope we could one day overcome. The point is whether you have the power to avenge yourself, which is part and parcel of whether you can be controlled, exploited, dominated, and so on. So there's a sense in which if the female partner in the relationship is not willing, we want her to be able to hurt us in some way because it proves that willingness when she doesn't hurt us, if that makes sense. And don't ask me to explain what Nietzsche is referencing by Chinese revenge at the end there. I haven't been able to figure that out. As far as the meaning, I mean, it's in reference to the woman hurting herself as a means of taking revenge against her partner. And I would simply extend Nietzsche's point and say that both genders can clearly do this to one another, and it doesn't just happen in China. But, hurting oneself to hurt the other person, it's really more of a pathological thing than a gender thing. But I'm not sure what reference Nietzsche is making there necessarily. And so that takes us back to the broader point, though. Regardless of our moral protestations, do we have more respect for the person who can take revenge, who has the capacity, the willingness to do so? And do most people want a partner that they can respect? So therefore, do people want a partner that would be willing to take revenge on them? So it's a very odd way to think about things that most of us would never say my ideal, personality traits for my dream girl is that she's willing to wield a dagger against me or even against herself. But, I don't know. Try putting that in your OkCupid profile or whatever, Tinder, must be willing to wield a dagger against me or even against herself. And you can even put the little parentheses that you're seeking someone who's willing to take Chinese revenge. Okay, let's go to 70. We're going to gloss over 70, actually. I'm not going to read this whole thing. The summary of the passage is that in opera, the deep and powerful alto voice can make us believe that, quote, somewhere in the world there could be women with lofty, heroic, and royal souls, capable of and ready for grandiose responses, resolutions, and sacrifices, etc., end quote. In other words, the unrealistic aesthetics of opera give us a false and idealized picture of the female gender. And at the end of the passage, Nietzsche admits, though, that the type of vocal range he describes, it's more often used to present an ideal male lover, such as Romeo. And he says that the theater regularly miscalculates on this point, that such lovers are unconvincing. In short, I think this kind of critique is worth glossing over because For one, it's almost a cliche at this point that popular artistic media misrepresents what men and women are really like, or like as lovers, like ideal lovers, right? It presents them as sort of idealized romantic partners that don't really exist in reality. And through the powerful aesthetics of the opera, of the dramatic production and the song and all that, we begin to believe, even just for a moment, that such a thing might exist. And the same could be said of the modern day, of the portrayal of romances in movies. And it's probably true to an even stronger degree, just because of how much more powerfully films can falsify reality, and how much more realistic such a false portrayal of reality can be, more so than opera, more so than it ever could. But, everyone knows that the simulacrum is unrealistic, at least these days. In post-modernity we do. So that's my gloss of 70. We can move on. Let's go to 71. Quote, "On female chastity, there is something quite amazing and monstrous about the education of upper-class women. What could be more paradoxical? All the world is agreed that they are to be brought up as ignorant as possible of erotic matters, and that one has to imbue their souls with a profound sense of shame in such matters until the merest suggestion of such things triggers the most extreme impatience and flight. The, quote, honor of women really comes into play only here. What else would one not forgive them? But here they are supposed to remain ignorant even in their hearts. They are supposed to have neither eyes nor ears, nor words, nor thoughts for this. They're evil. And mere knowledge is to be considered evil. And then to be hurled as by a gruesome lightning bolt into reality and knowledge by marriage, precisely by the man they love and esteem most. To catch love and shame in a contradiction, and to be forced to experience at the same time delight, surrender, duty, pity, terror, and who knows what else in the face of the unexpected neighborliness of God and beast. Thus a psychic knot has been tied that may have no equal. Even the compassionate curiosity of the wisest student of humanity is inadequate for guessing how this or that woman manages to accommodate herself to this solution of the riddle. And to the riddle of a solution, what dreary, far-reaching suspicions must stir in her poor unhinged soul, and how the ultimate philosophy and skepsis of woman casts anchor at this point. Afterward, the same deep silence as before, often a silence directed at herself too. She closes her eyes to herself. Young women try hard to appear superficial and thoughtless. The most refined simulate a kind of impertinence. Women easily experience their husbands as a question mark concerning their honor, and their children as an apology or atonement. They need children and wish for them in a way that is altogether different from that in which a man may wish for children. In some, one cannot be too kind about women." End quote. So here again, is this really a misogynistic passage? Certainly the elements are there, but Nietzsche's critique in the first passage, or the first paragraph rather, of the passage, could have been written by a feminist. It's about the contradiction of the current regime of etiquette around sexuality. Obviously, Nietzsche repeatedly mentions upper-class women here, noble women in these passages, because that's going to be the strata of society where the gender politics of the time are most strongly enforced, as it always is. As you move down to the lower classes, as we all know, it becomes more common to find women working, women dressing more immodestly, we might say, according to the standards of the time. And often that is for functional reasons. In lower class families, you have more situations of communal living and families sharing the same room and bathing and changing and dressing in the same rooms. And once you get down to the social strata of the farmer, like every warm, able body on the farm is better be a working body, right? So much of the etiquette around sexuality, keeping all knowledge of sexuality and the human body, keeping all of that away from young women as a matter of honor, and keeping them sort of pristine and sacrosanct from, any of the stains or dirt of the world, right? That is more true the higher in social status you go. And so Nietzsche is simply saying, when we look at the social or the sexual morality that is enforced at the highest social strata, what a contradiction to keep this knowledge from them. He quite literally says, that's what you're doing. You're keeping knowledge away from them for the sake of their honor, only to what? Have them get a crash course in how human biology works on their wedding night? Make the man that they've come to love and trust be the one who completely shatters that naivete, which would probably be traumatic in some way because you're totally unprepared for it, assuming that you actually were to succeed in keeping all this knowledge away from women. I personally don't believe that people have ever been successfully kept ignorant about sexuality, right? But, to the extent that you could actually succeed, it would be a monstrous contradiction. And so there's something terrible and contradictory, Nietzsche is saying, about how we educate women to chastity, and that they've been socially conditioned to associate sexuality with shame, and thus the man that must shame them most deeply is the man they're supposed to love and esteem most. And what a horrible contradiction this must create in their psyche. Would they not associate their husbands with shame and a violation? I mean, they've come to see him, or they're supposed to see him, according to the social standards, as the patriarch, the head of the household. That's sort of akin to like the god of the house, right? But he's the strange neighborliness of God and beast now, because in a bestial way, he has shamed them, right? And so he must become a contradictory figure, a question mark. And the child, a result of this violation, which is how it would be experienced, a kind of consolation or compensation for it. And so a lot of this is questionable as to how universal any of these psychological observations are, whether Nietzsche knows what he's talking about concerning the inner states of women. But that being said, again, Nietzsche at least has something interesting to say insofar as he's ultimately critical of how society tries to educate and enculturate women. And while he doesn't offer a solution, he reiterates the same thing that he said in an earlier passage, or it was really in the mouth of the sage: one can't be too kind to women. Which again, you could see that remark if you wanted as coming from a sexist place of saying women have no agency. But as a social and political reality in Germany at the time, they really did have very limited agency, so it's hard not to treat that as a fact of the matter. And it's worth noting, by the way, Nietzsche was one of the professors at Basel who voted in favor of allowing women to become students there. So, practically speaking, he advocated for women to have more agency. So once again, I'm not saying Nietzsche's insights here are particularly profound or far-reaching, or that we should be informed in our understanding of gender from Nietzsche. It's just not as simple as it's often made out to be, his positions. Let's go to 72. Quote, "Mothers. Animals do not think about females as men do. They consider the female the productive being. Paternal love does not exist among them, merely something like love for the children of a beloved and a kind of getting used to them. The females find in their children satisfaction for their desire to dominate, a possession, an occupation, something that is wholly intelligible to them and can be chattered with. The sum of all this is what mother love is. It is to be compared with an artist's love for his work. Pregnancy has made women kinder, more patient, more timid, more pleased to submit, and just so does spiritual pregnancy produce the character of the contemplative type, which is closely related to the feminine character. It consists of male mothers. Among animals, the male sex is considered the beautiful sex." End quote. Maybe an example of what Nietzsche's getting at the end there is we might think of like the peacock, or again the male lion, who has a more, there are many species where the male has to make sort of the display of beauty, the aesthetic display. The most interesting part of this passage is that Nietzsche is saying, for a man to understand a woman's relation to her child, he should think of how he sees his work of art, his projects, his creative work. And so Nietzsche makes the claim that how women love, what mother love is that's their chance to possess and to dominate. The child is their occupation. This is supposed to be explicable to men insofar as we feel the same way about, say the novel we write, or the house we build, or a campaign we wage, whatever it might be. We don't look at the artistic product of our lives as a thing with free will whose sovereignty has to be respected. It's mine. It's something of myself. It belongs to me forever. Right? It's forever a part of who I am. And the reason why I find this part interesting, it goes back to the same insight in Plato's Symposium. The mortal being doesn't seek immortality by being absolutely the same forever, as the divinity does, but rather by giving rise to offspring. So, for some people, this is literal genetic offspring. For the artist or the philosopher even, It's his work, his legacy. And so there's this equation between genetic offspring and artistic offspring in the symposium. Actually, it's not an equation, that's wrong. It's a comparison. It's a similarity, but it's not the same, because the artistic offspring, well, particularly the one type of offspring, one's philosophy, their virtue, and one's epigony, who follow in that instruction and virtue, that's actually argued by Socrates to be the superior way of attaining to the immortal. And so perhaps if this passage is to be seen as misogynistic, it's also misogynistic in a very Greek manner, insofar as Nietzsche is saying, if you want to understand woman and her child, understand it by comparison to, it's like the Pandemian version of Eros, right? The male artistic drive is a Uranian version of Eros. The male version is clearly higher, clearly superior, but they're aimed at the same value, which is Eros, which in the final analysis is like love for oneself and the things of oneself, the desire for oneself to continue. And so I see that influence of the symposium in this passage. So yeah, let's move on to 73. Quote, "Holy cruelty. A man who held a newborn child in his hands approached a holy man. 'What shall I do with this child?' he asked. 'It is wretched, misshapen, and does not have enough life to die.' 'Kill it,' shouted the holy man with a terrible voice, 'and then hold it in your arms for 3 days and 3 nights to create a memory for yourself. Never again will you beget a child this way when it is not time for you to beget.' When the man had heard this, he walked away, disappointed, and many people reproached the holy man because he had counseled cruelty, for he had counseled the man to kill the child. 'But is it not crueler to let it live?' asked the holy man." End quote. This is one of the most important passages in all of Nietzsche's work, actually. It also expresses a fundamentally Greek sentiment, specifically a Lacedaemonian sentiment, which is just to say a Spartan sentiment, that it's better to cull the population, better to cull away all those who would not normally survive than it is to let them live a subpar and painful existence that will ultimately drag everyone else down and over the generations propagate even more suffering and even more weakness as their ailments are passed on through the bloodline and allowed to survive and tolerated. And so this is, it must be said, ultimately a eugenic position. But we should take note of what eugenic means in this context. Eu is a prefix meaning good or pleasant or beneficial. Dis is a prefix meaning bad, difficult, impaired, or painful. So eugenic would mean good genes, or genes which are beneficial to the genetic line, and dysgenic would mean genes which are harmful and are debilitating. And there's a lot of trepidation about eugenics in the modern day, but in the 19th century, for what it's worth, eugenics was just a fairly common position. Robert Solomon, for instance, points out that George Bernard Shaw is among those who were in favor of eugenics. And his statements on eugenics are not really all that different from Nietzsche's, except, this one's particularly harsh. But let's look at the way this passage is framed. Why is it an old saint that, why is it a holy man that gives us this eugenic sentiment? Because the saint, the ascetic, the holy man, this is a merciful figure. He's supposed to be a merciful figure, sort of in our collective consciousness, right? The saint is the one with the compassion for us worldly sinners. And what does he say of the malformed child that's brought to him? He says, kill it. And the people say, that's cruel. And the saint says, it's crueler to let it live. Or he phrases it as a question, but we can take the insight here that it would be crueler to let it live. So the significance here is that in the mouth of the very avatar of compassion, of mercy, the holy man, we get the message that true mercy would be not to let the child who's going to live a life afflicted with suffering live that life. Like, just to put it in terms of like a modern congenital illness we know of, if you know a child is going to live a short, painful life afflicted with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, for example, isn't it more merciful to euthanize that child? Now, this is funny to consider in light of the fact that Nietzsche may have had CADASIL, a congenital stroke disorder. So I could make the argument, wouldn't it have been merciful to put Nietzsche down as a newborn? He's going to live a life of migraines and nausea and dizziness and blindness. Maybe we can set that aside, but I couldn't help but point that out at least, so it's something to keep in mind. But I would say that Nietzsche has a real point here insofar as it is an example of pity multiplying suffering. That's fundamentally Nietzsche's critique of pity. I mean, it appears on the surface level to be a compassionate position. The position stated here, it's quite literally and absolutely pro-life, to the point that we should let even those who will suffer their whole lives experience life. But I suppose the counter would be, is it really pro-life? What is life really? How did all life that exists now come to be? It came to be through natural selection. If you take away those selection mechanisms, what you get instead is the multiplication of weakened forms of life, of suffering forms of life, beings who will experience life as something unpleasant. And the kind of sentience that would all likelihood come to be over long generations out of this would be a sentience that condemns life. And that's how pity operates. It makes life less appealing by allowing more suffering to propagate, such that it becomes a plausible syllogism to say, this samsaric world must be condemned. It can only be justified by a higher, superordinate world of contentment, pleasure, and so on. Now, however you fall in that question, and by the way, I don't think it's crazy to say that at the very least, just to show my own cards here, if we could edit the genome to remove degenerative and crippling diseases, or abort children before they were even born with such diseases, why would we not do so? A lot of the arguments, the pearl clutching around this doesn't make sense to me. To be opposed to this would be to say that certain people should just be destined to suffer for no reason, or no other reason than what? That God decreed it? That's not a very impressive argument to me. But however you feel about this, I mean, Nietzsche's point is just to call into question. He doesn't advocate for a position here. What he's calling into question is, which is the merciful position? Is it actually more merciful not to euthanize someone whose entire life is going to be an experience of agony? And let's say we know that for a fact. Is it not crueler to let the child live? And I think even those who come down strongly on the side of letting the child live would have to admit that there are reasons for doing so. There's some sort of moral principle operating in their thought, which is not strictly compassion or mercy. There's some sort of irrational demand that, like, life is sacred or something like that. There's something that in them that believes life is good in spite of the suffering within it, which, by the way, Nietzsche would think is a very noble thing to think. And that, therefore, that would kind of imply that they think it's justified to cause suffering so that life can continue. But if you adopt that principle, that's not the more merciful position. It's just simply not. And all sorts of thoughts might follow from that argument, which will probably run aground of the modern morality in different ways. And so that's why passages like this one are incredibly useful. It's not, very rarely is the useful thing in reading Nietzsche or the insightful thing just simply to come out on the other side agreeing with the opinions of Nietzsche. It's the things that he points out about what our beliefs imply and what they demand, and what we find necessary, and so on and so forth, and thinking critically about what we believe. Okay, lastly, we're going to just gloss over just two more aphorisms today, which are the final ones on women. And I think they offer very little in the way of insights, but we'll still just read them. Quote, "Failures. Those poor women always fail, who in the presence of the man they love become restless and unsure of themselves and talk too much. For what seduces men, most surely, is a certain secretive and phlegmatic tenderness." End quote. So this speaks for itself. Nietzsche is saying the mystique of a woman is what attracts men. Revealing too much of herself because of her insecurities, perhaps, will turn men away. But I think, once again, stating that universally is a bit crazy. Denying it happens sometimes would also seem to be unjustified. So in most mature relationships, in a marriage, for example, I mean, as I said before, all the mystique of your partner eventually disappears. So that's not the thing that sustains relationships. But, Nietzsche would have understood that if he'd ever gotten married. Okay, finally, 75, which is just as insipid, but this one is at least funny. And it's become something of a minor meme on the internet. 75, quote, "The third sex. A small man is a paradox, but still a man, but small females seem to me to belong to another sex than tall women, said an old dancing master. A small woman is never beautiful, said old Aristotle. End quote. Kaufman notes in a footnote, Aristotle's actual sentiment is that greatness of the soul corresponds to greatness of body, and that therefore all people, man or woman, people of small proportions, they could be fit or perfectly symmetrical and attractive. They could have everything necessary to be beautiful, but their smallness prevents them from truly attaining beauty. He doesn't actually specifically mention women in that passage. So, there's not really much here in the way of philosophical insights. I mean, all Nietzsche is really saying is no short chicks, short girls, get out, GTFO. As Kaufman says, this is both the end of the passages where Nietzsche discusses women, and it's also the nadir. It's the low point of the whole diatribe. But with that, we're done. And we've covered pretty much all of the gender politics and the gay science. And if you made it through even this episode with me, then congratulations. You've made it through the sloggiest part of the book so far. And truly, it is all uphill from here. I hope I was able to present something of value in sort of the latter half of this episode anyway. But even if you didn't enjoy this, when we come back next week, a lot of the aphorisms that follow this in Book 2 are about art and about the Greeks and sort of a return to form for Nietzsche and for this book. So please join me then. By the time you are all hearing this, I am out on the road on tour with my band. I believe I should be somewhere in Ohio by the time this episode airs. So, look out for that on social media. I'll be posting pictures and I'll make another tour documentary. And it's an exciting time for me, and I'll try and share it with all of you to whatever degree that I can. So with that, we're done for the week. Cheers, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.